Blog Talk Radio.
You are now listening to True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Gacy, Bundy, Dahmer, The Night Stalker, BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author, Dan Zupansky.
Hello, this is your host, Dan Zupansky, for the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. My special guest this evening is Amanda Lamb. With her book, we're going to be profiling this evening, is Evil Next Door. Good evening, Amanda. How are you?
Good evening, Dan. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you very much. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Excuse me, just for a second. Courtesy of our telephone service here, I'm having a couple technical errors here or technical difficulties. So let me get past that, and we'll introduce the program like we normally do by I get a chance to be able to read the back cover of your book, a very good description of your book, and intro for our program this evening. On May 21st, 2002, 23-year-old Raleigh, North Carolina resident Stephanie Bennett was found murdered in her apartment. Despite ample DNA evidence at the scene, investigators could find no matches in their criminal databases. 2 years into the investigation, Detective Ken Copeland, known as the garbage man for leaving no stone unturned in his search for evidence, and his partner, Jackie Taylor, joined the case. After culling through the entire file with fresh eyes and re-interviewing witnesses, they released a description of a suspect neighbors had seen nearby, a man who'd once lived just next door to the murder scene. But the suspect refused to hand over a DNA sample, wiping down anything he touched and even planting decoy samples. This is the gripping story of how a team of aggressive detectives doggedly tracked down a killer under suspicion for a killing spree that investigators believe might have spanned years and crossed state lines, and brought closure to an innocent young woman's grieving family. Evil Next Door, the untold story of a killer undone by DNA. My very special guest, Amanda Lamb. Welcome to the program, Amanda.
Thank Dan.
Now, why did you decide to write about this case in particular?
Well, I've been a television reporter for 20 years, and I've covered crime pretty exclusively for the past 8. And I've covered a lot of crimes where I've been there for the crime and then been able to follow it all the way through the judicial system until somebody is arrested and ultimately convicted. And this was one of those cases that I had followed very closely. It was a 3.5-year investigation prior to anything coming to fruition. And this was one of those cases that really shocked Raleigh, North Carolina, where I'm a reporter, because it was a stranger murder. And as you know, Dan, probably from your research and your writing, that most people are killed by somebody they know. And in Raleigh, North Carolina, we don't have a lot of stranger murders. So this was really a needle in a haystack kind of a situation. I mean, this young woman was going about her life, doing what most of us do, working, going home at night. She had no high-risk behavior, and yet she was raped, tortured, and murdered in her own home. And so she really was truly what we call an innocent victim. I mean, she was somebody that had did nothing to encourage this behavior, and yet the worst possible thing happened to her. And I think that just based on that, it intrigued me. And then as I researched the case and got to know her family and her friends, I learned more about her, and she was just really a lovely young woman. She was somebody that could have been your daughter your sister, your wife. She was just starting out her life. She had a lot of promise. She was kind. She was a hard worker. She really was somebody that I think anybody would have been proud to call their daughter or their friend or their sister.
Now, what was she doing in Raleigh, North Carolina? Tell us how about, the circumstances. She came to leave her hometown in Virginia. It's a Rocky Mount, Virginia.
Right,
and traveled to Raleigh. And who did she go with? And tell us, where she was living in Raleigh, and what she was doing, where she was working, and what really Raleigh, North Carolina is like. Sort of, is it a bigger center? Describe sort of the community where she lived in.
And for people that don't know, I mean, Raleigh is the capital of North Carolina, and so, of course, this is where our state government is. And it's become much more urban and certainly much more metropolitan in the last, 2 decades. We have an area called Research Triangle Park where we have a lot of pharmaceutical companies. We have a lot of technology companies. We also have Duke University, Wake Forest University, and other schools that attract a lot of PhDs and people that are interested in research and teaching and other fields. And so Raleigh to Stephanie Bennett was really a big city. I mean, she was from a very small rural town in Virginia, and her family was actually nervous about her going to Raleigh. I mean, to them it might as well have been New York City because it seemed so daunting. But she was a young woman who really wanted to be out on her own. She was a subcontractor for IBM, and it was a great professional opportunity for her to work in her field in computers. And she had a serious boyfriend and had intended to get married, but before she did that, she really wanted to be out on her own. So she came to Raleigh with 2 girls from college. One of them happened to be her best friend and stepsister from a very young age. And the 3 girls did what a lot of young women in their 20s did then. It's something that I did, and it's something that, young women still do today. You get out of college, you find some roommates that you can afford to, share an apartment with, and you start your career. And that's basically what she was doing here in Raleigh. Right.
Now, was Stephanie worried about anything when she did live in Raleigh? Was that part of her nature to be a little bit of a worry wart, maybe not even want to be in Raleigh anymore?
I think she was just a cautious young woman. I mean, this was not a girl that was out at the bars drinking every night and, going home with men and, doing, again, anything that we would consider high-risk behavior. She was a cautious young woman. She lived in an area of Raleigh that had a lot of apartment complexes. In fact, I think the tally from police at the time was that there were 5,000 apartments within like a 5-mile vicinity. And so it was a place where a lot of young people lived. She lived in a first-floor apartment, which I think in hindsight, most people would say that's not very safe. But, again, this was, 10 years ago, and it just didn't seem like Raleigh, North Carolina was a place that you needed to be worried about something like this happening. And so, I think that she was, again, just going about her life, doing the normal things that people would do, and yet she did have this cautious streak in her. And at one point, there was a report that somebody had been kind of peeping into windows in the apartment complex. And that made her uncomfortable, and so uncomfortable that she wrote an email to her aunt about it and talked about, I think I'm going to give up my lease at some point soon and move out. And she had wanted to be closer to her boyfriend, who was attending graduate school in South Carolina about 4 hours away. And so she talked about moving to South Carolina and leaving that apartment complex.
In fact, she didn't have much time left. Actually, it was maybe a month.
Yeah, it looked like it was about a month, I think, left on her lease before she would leave, and she had already, talked to the other girls about it. And she was ready to go. There were some break-ins, there was some vandalism, and there were just a couple of things in the apartment complex, but the thing that really upset her was this Peeping Tom, and it was later discovered, and we're not sure how much Stephanie knew, but it was discovered that this Peeping Tom had actually been looking in her particular window. She did not see this, but another neighbor had reported it. And so that would naturally alarm anybody, and of course it alarmed her with good reason.
Now, she lived with her stepsister and a really good friend, and part of the feature that you explain is that they were always together, basically, no matter what. Just despite work schedules, there's always somebody around. What was this particular feature of this weekend in May that was unusual?
It was unusual because, again, like you said, they were always together. They were three best friends that did everything together. But as their lives kind of became more complicated, one had a boyfriend back in Virginia. Stephanie had the boyfriend in South Carolina. Her stepsister had gone home for a funeral back to Virginia. And so on this particular night, Stephanie was alone. And Stephanie really didn't like to be alone. She didn't like to stay alone. She wasn't used to that. I mean, again, she'd grown up in a small town in a close-knit community, and that wasn't, her preference to be alone. So on this particular night, she was alone. She had spent the weekend visiting her boyfriend in South Carolina and come home, and she had gone to work on Monday morning, just like she always does. And that night, she'd come home from work and had a conversation with one of the roommates, Emily, on the phone, and she'd also had a conversation with her boyfriend on the phone. And they had talked about her getting an apartment in South Carolina, and he said that he needed some information from her and that she needed to fax it so that he could take it to the apartment complex to fill out the application. And so she told him that night that she would try to do that from her office the next day. So this was, again, an unusual thing for her to be alone in her apartment that night. And for all intents and purposes, though, it appeared like any other night in the beginning.
Right. Now, the next day, on May 21st, who is the first person that notices something is amiss?
Well, again, her boyfriend and she had had this conversation about her sending this information for the apartment application. And so he emails her, he calls her. He's not able to get up with her, and he thinks that's a little bit unusual. And at some point contacts her stepsister, and the stepsister immediately says, something's not right here, because this is not Stephanie. Stephanie's a person that returns phone calls, returns emails. And again, we're talking 10 years ago. People didn't have BlackBerries, and they weren't as immediately, they weren't as readily able to get up with somebody by email as people are today. But
right.
It was still a time. I mean, she worked at IBM. She was on the computer all the time. So eventually they discovered that she hadn't shown up for work. The stepsister did. And the stepsister then started calling around. She even had a friend go by the apartment and, looked to see if somebody was home. Of course, nobody came to the door. And so at that point, the stepsister then contacts the management of the apartment complex and gives them permission to go into the apartment to unlock the door, because she was on the lease and she was able to give them that permission.
Yeah, and the thing, too, another point was that her car was there.
Correct. Her car was there. And so that was an immediate red flag. This was not a girl who didn't show up for work and not call somebody. This was not a girl who didn't return calls from friends and family. This was a responsible girl. She, over and over and over, I heard, Stephanie did what she was supposed to do. Stephanie was a very reliable, responsible young woman. And so immediately they knew something just wasn't right here in this scenario.
Now, you gave permission to the manager to be able to go into the apartment, and what did he find, and then what did he do?
It was actually a female manager, and she had one of the maintenance staff open the door. They went in, and they found Stephanie not in her bedroom, but in the bedroom of one of the roommates, and she had been sexually assaulted and murdered. And at the time, they didn't know how she had died. It was later discovered that she was strangled, but there were clear marks on her neck and around her wrists and ankles where she had been tied up. And so it was just, as you can imagine, for somebody that doesn't know somebody, even, it was just an awful, awful scene to witness that. And, of course, it was very difficult and emotional for that manager to see that, and then she immediately called the police.
Now, the person that's is the first responder is Lieutenant Chris Morgan and Major Crimes Task Force. Can you tell us a little bit about this man's character? What was he like? He's a veteran cop.
He is.
Tell us a little about his background.
He's an old school cop. I mean, Chris had been a cop for almost 30 years, and I actually wrote another book with Chris called Deadly Dose prior to this book, where he was the lead investigator up until the end. This case, he actually retired before it was completed, but he was absolutely passionate about it. And Chris is, again, he's an old school cop. He's somebody that he's got a big personality, a big stature. He's a good old boy on one hand, and then on the other hand, he's quoting Shakespeare. Just a very intelligent guy, a guy that had a lot of street smarts, just sometimes went with his gut, and that's not always popular in today's world where we want everything nailed down with facts and DNA and specific scientific evidence. And Chris was more kind of an off-the-cuff kind of guy. Most of the time he was right. He wasn't always right, and he would be the first person to admit that. But quite a character and just passionate about the cases that he covered, to the point where, again, he would admit he just got very, very close to the victims' families and to the victims themselves. I mean, Chris was a guy that you walked into his office and he had pictures of the victims up on the bulletin board behind his desk. And when I would ask him why he did that, he said, because I want to always remember who I'm working for. And at the end of the day, that's who he was. He was somebody that just would do anything, go to the mat for these victims and their memories and try to do whatever he could to solve these cases. And at the time that he responded to this scene, Chris had twin daughters that were in their late teens. And so you can imagine this was just devastating for him, because all he could think about was, this could be my daughter. I mean, Stephanie was in her early 20s, 23 years old, and it was just, he said it was actually the worst thing he's ever seen, which it's interesting because, again, you as a journalist and someone who's covered these cases before knows that there are a lot of crime scenes that are very bloody and very, very hard to even imagine somebody doing that to another human being. And this was not one of those scenes. This was not a bloody scene, but it was just heart-wrenching to see this young woman who had been just so violated and tortured up until the moment she died.
You said that there was marks where she had been tied and bound. There was another thing that Chris Morgan noticed about the strangulation itself that he thought was unusual.
Yeah, I think, and this was later discovered from the autopsy, but that it was done with something called a garrote, which is a French type of a restraint, if you will, that has a piece of wood or some other bar in it that you actually use to tighten and release around the person's neck. So again, it's more than just cutting off somebody's air supply. It's slowly killing them. And at that point, that person obviously knows what's happening, that they're dying, and it's just it's a absolute torture is what it is. And this was somebody that Chris immediately thought, this is not somebody who knows this woman, and this, because it didn't appear to be a disorganized crime, a crime of passion, this seems to be something that was well planned, well organized by somebody that knew exactly what they were doing. And again, very frightening to think about that kind of a person in a place like Raleigh, North Carolina, that rarely ever has a crime like this.
And now is on the loose as well. And what Morgan had said as well, which is evidence of what you're saying, is that when using the garrote, that this is somebody that had some sort of pre-planning, or at least understands strangulation. It's disturbing to realize that they have this method. It's not, you say it's not in the throes of passion.
Absolutely. I mean, I've covered several domestic cases where the assailant has tried to smother or strangle somebody and not done so successfully and ended up using other means. And the reason is because those of us who, watch television, you watch a Lifetime movie, you think it's very easy to cut off somebody's air supply with your hands or by putting a pillow over their face, and that's just simply not the case. It's much harder than it looks. So this was a guy who really knew what he was doing and brought his implements with him. There was nothing left at the scene, and that was the other thing. So the restraints were gone from the ankles and from her wrists, and the implement that was used to strangle her was also gone. So this was somebody who pre-planned this very carefully.
Now, what did police conclude in their investigation about how he got into the building or what was involved with him attacking Stephanie Bennett in her own home? What did they conclude?
Well, what they surmised was that he had come in through a window. There was a window in this extra bedroom that belonged to one of the roommates, Emily Metro, the friend that was not the stepsister, and she was out of town visiting her boyfriend at the time. And the window, it's still unclear whether the window was unlocked and left open or whether the window wouldn't lock. There was a faulty window lock, and so there was some question as to exactly what happened with that window. But they found things under the window, some pine needles that could have come off the bush on the outside of the window where he came in. They also found some things that had been on the windowsill that had been moved, and so the thought was that he had to move them in order not to knock them over. The belief is that he probably had been watching the apartment and knew that she was alone that night, and so therefore he could have even, maybe if the window was slightly ajar, heard her talking on the phone about being home alone and been monitoring that. The thought is that he could have come in while she was still awake and then waited until she went to sleep before he went into her room. The covers of her bed were pulled back very neatly and folded very neatly on the floor. So investigators believe that she was in fact asleep when he did enter her room, and that he then pulled back the covers and restrained her somehow. She slept with pillows kind of around her in a U shape, and the pillows were found in that shape. So there was a half a glass of iced tea next to the bed. She was reading a Harry Potter book that was left open on the nightstand. And so again, she had a night just like any other night where she did what a lot of us do. We get into bed, we read a book, we have a drink next to the bed, and we go to sleep, and then of course was awoken to this awful scene. She had one slight defensive mark above her eye and also a few scratches around her knee area, and they think that maybe those occurred when he initially startled her in her bed before he restrained her. And then, of course, she was no longer able to fight back.
Now, they found plenty of DNA evidence in plenty of places, we'll say, on Stephanie's body.
Correct.
So ample DNA evidence he left his semen at the scene. How do police proceed with this case from there?
Well, of course, DNA is the best evidence you can have, but it's also the worst evidence if you have nothing to match it to. And in this case, he clearly knew what he was doing. He knew that he was leaving DNA all over the scene, and he didn't care. And he didn't care because his DNA was not on file. In North Carolina, we have a law that if you are convicted of a felony, that your DNA immediately goes into this database. And so if we had had that law, it really wouldn't have mattered. We didn't have it at the time, but it wouldn't have mattered because he had never been convicted of a crime.
Right.
And he knew that. So they were very frustrated. It was a needle in a haystack situation, and they started just basically going through these apartment complexes. Every single man anywhere in that vicinity was asked to do a mouth swab with a Q-tip, which they would then test at our State Bureau of Investigation lab to see if the DNA was a match. And so it was just this constant process of elimination, but really with no end in sight because it could have been anybody. I mean, the suspect was any man that had any access to that apartment complex, which, again, could have been anybody.
Now, you mentioned the Peeping Tom. Maybe I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but when do police make a connection that the Peeping Tom may have been the same person, and what is the initial sort of description for other police, at least. I know they didn't release a composite right away, but what exactly did the police have as any kind of suspect at all? Is the Peeping Tom involved in that?
Clearly, I mean, the Peeping Tom is initially looked at as the suspect. And there is a very early composite of him that involves a hooded sweatshirt, sunglasses. Actually, that was a later composite. The earlier composite didn't have all those details, but there was an earlier composite of the Peeping Tom. And for some reason, they started to move away from that, which was a fatal mistake because it eventually, the investigation lagged for several years, languished really, until these new investigators came on and started to look at that theory. And it makes sense because the bottom line is not all Peeping Toms rape, but all rapists are Peeping Toms at some point is what you will hear from any kind of forensic investigators. Sure. And in this case, they did revisit this, but it took about 2 years to go back to the Peeping Tom. And when they did and they started talking to more people, they got a better description. And that description included tall, lanky, sunglasses, walking a big dog, hooded sweatshirt. I mean, pretty specific stuff to the point where they were able to start to zero in on who this person might be.
Now, the people that came on board and looked at this case with new eyes and a new perspective were Ken Copeland and his partner, Jackie Taylor. Tell us a little bit about these people and how they infused this new energy into this investigation.
Correct. When Chris Morgan retired and he was very frustrated that he couldn't solve this case, it was actually one of the most difficult things about his retirement that he left without solving this case. He tapped Ken Copeland to handle this case. And actually a lot of people thought Ken didn't have enough experience at the time to do that. Chris saw something in Ken that he really didn't have in himself, was this very methodical way of approaching a case, looking at every single thing, not throwing anything away. And in fact, he dubbed Ken the garbage man because Ken picked up every scrap of evidence or every scrap of potential evidence and looked at it. Things that Chris would have said, I'm moving on, I'm not looking at that. That's the kind of stuff Ken looked at. Ken was a former Marine. He's a Native American, first person in his family to go to college. Ken had really risen up through the ranks of the Raleigh Police Department and made his family very proud. But a very humble guy and a guy that was very easy to talk to for the average person, and that also bode well, for being an investigator because he was able to get people to open up to him. Jackie was a female investigator, kind of an anomaly in the Raleigh Police Department at the time, and was kind of a mother hen to the other detectives. But again, her special strength was interrogating/investigating people or interviewing people because she was a woman who had this kind of motherly, nurturing way about her, and people would open up to her. So they were a great combination. They were a great team with the way that they approached the case. And they went back through thousands of pages of documents that had been amassed over this 2-year period and tips and leads, and they just started looking through all this stuff, and they came back to the Peeping Tom. They just said, this is what makes sense. And they started to piece together the descriptions, and they started to re-interview some people. And their big break actually came from just doing good old-fashioned police work, knocking on doors. And they ended up at the apartment complex, not where Stephanie lived, but apartment complex about 50 yards through the woods from where Stephanie lived. And they got the tip that really led them in the right direction.
How did they get an original tip that this guy lived in the Dominion apartments at one time? So then the officers, Copeland and Taylor, went to the apartment. Tell us, it was real fascinating how it almost didn't happen as well. I mean, they were talking to some ladies.
Exactly. I mean, it was very casual. The apartment complex where Stephanie lived, her father, Carmen, had filed a lawsuit against the apartment complex, basically saying they were negligent in their security procedures, and that's why his daughter was a victim. And so as a result, that apartment complex had really shut down. They were no longer talking to the police. So Ken and Jackie went next door, and they did what they always do. They chatted. They drank tea. They ate cookies. They hung out in the apartment office. And so Ken starts talking very casually about this description that was becoming much more clear of this Peeping Tom. And he said, anybody know this guy? Big guy, lanky, kind of strange, didn't look you in the eye, wore sunglasses, walked a big dog. And a woman walks out from the back office and says, I know him. That's Drew Planton. He used to live here, and he's a strange bird. And so all of a sudden, after years of investigating this case, they had a name. All of a sudden, they had this name to go with this description. And it was the turning point in the case to get that name. And then they were able to, again, corroborate some of this information, but they went to another apartment of a woman that had lived there for a long time, and they said to her, do you know this man? Have you heard of this man? And she said, well, that's the man that killed that girl. And he said, oh, my gosh, well, how long have you thought this? And she said, I know we were talking about it. I don't remember when, but the crime scene tape was still up. So, basically, right after this murder happened, neighbors were talking about this guy. And somehow, even in all the interviews that they did and all the canvassing that they did of that neighborhood, that name never came up in the early stages of the investigation, and it was 2 years later. A lot more than 2 years, actually, by the time that, Jackie and Ken got to that name.
Right. Now, as a result of having Drew Planton as a suspect, tell us about the police's approach of this. What was their strategy to be able to speak with him? And obviously they're trying to look for a DNA sample. So what was their first approach, and what was Drew Planton's first reaction, and how did he act when police confronted him and spoke with him?
Initially, they went to his apartment a couple times, or the address that they believed to be his apartment, and they got no response. Nobody came to the door. There was a big dog that they heard on the other side of the door, so they felt pretty confident that they had the right apartment because they had gotten the information from the Department of Motor Vehicles. They didn't think the picture looked like the composite, but they thought, we're still going to check this out. And they were doing it in between all of their other murder cases that continued to go on. So they finally got some information about where he worked, and it turns out he was a scientist who worked for the Agriculture Department for the state of North Carolina in one of their laboratories. So they decided they would confront him at work. And they went to his office and they asked for him. And Jackie specifically remembers him coming down the stairs at the office, and there was a glass partition, and she was looking at him, and she said it was uncanny. It was exactly how they described him. I mean, he had this gaunt look about him. He was just this tall, lanky man, long, kind of straggly hair, and looking down at the ground. And when he came up to them, he, put his hand out to shake his hand once they introduced themselves. And Ken said, on one hand, he looked like you could just knock him over with a feather, that he was just so frail. But on the other hand, he said his handshake was like a death grip. It was like a vice. It was so strong. And Ken, again, this big guy, he's a Marine. He looks like a Marine, big, muscular guy. And so for Ken to say that his handshake was that strong really meant something. And right away, they felt like they had to look into this guy, that something was not right, that everything about him seemed very strange, and that they were possibly standing there talking to the person who had killed Stephanie Bennett.
Now, tell us a little bit, for the audience, let's give a little bit of background on Drew Planton, and also tell our audience about Drew Planton's mother and what her occupation is, because that's going to be important. I think it is important to the story.
It is, absolutely. Yeah, Drew Planton grew up in Michigan. He was one of 4 boys, and his mother actually had moved the family from New Jersey when they were younger amid allegations of domestic violence from their father. She was basically somebody who pulled herself up by the bootstraps, put herself through college, through law school, became a lawyer, and became very active in this community in Michigan in dealing with domestic violence issues, and even opened a domestic violence shelter. Drew Planton was always a very reclusive shy, antisocial young man, very bright, did well in school, but really didn't have many other interests and no friends to speak of outside of school. And he'd done a couple of odd jobs in Michigan, but nothing ever really stuck. And then he eventually had interviewed for this chemist position over the phone in Raleigh and gotten the job. And so he had left Michigan in the late 90s and gone to Raleigh, which was a completely foreign territory for him from the area around Lansing, Michigan, where he grew up. But his mother felt like, this was a good opportunity for him to kind of start his life. And he had some connections to Raleigh. He had a brother that had gotten married there, and he had another brother in the western part of the state. So there were some connections to North Carolina. But again, even once he moved to North Carolina, there's no indication that he had any friends or any social life or really any connection with anybody outside of the workplace. And even in the workplace, he was very reclusive. After that first meeting with the detectives, they asked if they could meet him at his apartment and have an interview. And he agreed to do that. And that in itself was just another kind of a red flag for Jackie and Ken, because when they got to the apartment, he let them in, but just a few feet in the door, it was clear he didn't want them to look around. It was also clear that he had prepared very carefully for the interview and that he was not going to give up any information that he didn't have to give up. I mean, again, his mother's a lawyer, and they knew that about him. And during the interview, there were a few things that were inconsistent with what they knew to be true, and they immediately started to be suspicious about him. He said, for example, that he never wore glasses, but the DMV records showed that he had a restricted license. He said that he had never smoked. There was evidence that he had smoked, and there were just many little things. But ultimately, at the end of that interview, they said, will you give us a DNA sample? And they said, we know your mother's a lawyer. You can think about it for a couple of days and let us know. And the deadline that they gave him, they waited for that email to come. Ken said it was like watching, a pot of water boil or waiting for that to boil, and he stood around his computer, and at precisely 5 o'clock on the deadline day, he sent them one line that said, I will not give you my DNA. And so at that point, it was game on.
Right. So how do they, well, you can talk about Joanne Reilly, and how did they go about thinking that they might, at least in the beginning, how they were going to get a DNA sample from,
right.
How did they proceed? Was he put under surveillance?
Well, initially they thought they could, get it from some kind of a public source, whether it be the handle of his car, some kind of a piece of trash that he threw down. But he was a scientist, and he was pretty smart. He knew how not to leave his DNA. Whether he knew that they were following him or not is still up for debate, but he certainly knew that he was under suspicion from the Raleigh police. Right. One of the things that Ken did was he made a connection with a woman who worked in the laboratory, who was supervising the laboratory where Drew Planton worked, and her name was Joanne Reilly. And Joanne became, in some ways, almost a detective. She was somebody that clearly wanted to help the police, but she was also somebody who clearly believed that Drew Planton was a sweet young man who was misunderstood, and she had a very motherly kind of relationship with him, or developed a motherly relationship with him over the course of the investigation. And she really felt like she would be helping to clear his name by helping the police get DNA. Right. And they had all sorts of scenarios that they went through to try to do this. I mean, she had a day where she gave everybody popsicles, and then she went to take his popsicle sticks from his drawer because he kept all of his trash. Again, this is the scientist knowing that the DNA leaves a trail, and so he's throwing things away. He's not throwing anything away. He's washing things down. I mean, to the point where they said he even cut up his trash and flushed it down the toilet. And so she went to retrieve these popsicle sticks, and he came into the lab, and she heard him come in. And she was terrified because she was starting to believe, well, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe he could be guilty. And she took those popsicle sticks and put them in the waistband of her pants so that he would not see her. and it ended up that they were never able to get DNA from that source. But there were several other incidents, and ultimately Joanne's help was a big part of them getting some DNA that led them in the right direction.
Tell us about the eventual, like you say, there's all these missteps where the popsicle stick, she was there, she was in the drawer, he comes in, she has to abandon the operation.
Right. Yeah.
But now she has told police that he has gloves that he uses all the time, and the police ascertain that this may be their best bet. So what do they do? They know there is a decision that they could swab the gloves, but what did they ultimately do?
Well, they're worried that if they take the gloves that he'll notice, and of course they're concerned that he could hurt himself, could hurt other people, or he could run. And what led up to this was they did have a luncheon at a buffet restaurant that Joanne set up, and they had 2 undercover police officers there. And during that luncheon, he usually ate finger food, and so they didn't think they were going to get anything. But at one point, he picks up a fork and eats some banana pudding with it. Then he sticks the fork in his glass of water, wipes it down, and they leave the luncheon. Well, the police take that fork thinking, there may be nothing here, but we're going to get it tested. They take it to the SBI lab, and the scientist from the lab calls and says, I've got good and bad news. The good news is there are 6 chromosomal markers out of the 16 needed to connect this DNA with the killer's DNA, and that's a great start. Won't hold up in court, but you're going in the right direction. The bad news was there was also other DNA on the fork, which meant the fork had not been properly washed by the restaurant. But long story short, that put them in the direction of knowing they had to get DNA from the lab because they knew for sure that was a place where his DNA would be found. Again, even though he's cleaning up, he's wiping down surfaces, he's literally picking his hair up off the ground when he brushes his hair if he leaves the strand. So they finally got the DA to agree to go into the lab and be able to take these gloves, and they replaced the gloves with another set, and they tested those gloves, and it was a match. And so at that point, they decided we could wait or we could, just go for it, because waiting, again, could cause these other scenarios of somebody getting hurt or him hurting himself or him running. And another little sidebar to this is that they also tested his brother's DNA in the western part of the state, because his brother had been charged with basically a peeping crime. He had set up a camera in a women's bathroom in the architectural firm where he worked. So he had a history of sex crimes, and no 2 people's DNA are exactly alike, but brothers, siblings are closer than any others. And so their thought was, we need to check his DNA to make sure it's not him, that he hadn't come and visited. So his DNA was not a match, and Drew Planton's DNA was a perfect match.
Right now, when we have Officer Sperlin and Mark Booty, and tell us about the day that they actually run the DNA. They get enough DNA and they run Drew Planton's DNA through there, and then who do they call first, and what's the reaction?
Everybody, again, they've been working on this case for 3.5 years, and they call Ken, who is at the fairgrounds, because he's working off-duty security at our state fair, and, he's just overjoyed, and Jackie's jumping up and down, and the district attorney, Susan Sperlin, as you mentioned, she's the one who gives the go-ahead to say, you know what, we're going to take him down. We're not going to wait because we can't afford to wait. And Mark Baudet is this SBI agent who's done all of this elimination testing for years, and now finally he's got the match. And so, there's just a lot of relief, excitement. We're going in the right direction. And they surround the agriculture lab, and they call Joanne, and they tell Joanne what's going on. And, of course, Joanne is, upset. It's a match, they tell her. But she knows at this point that she's, they've got it, and she's got to move forward and help the police. And they tell her to find him in the building, and he's now kind of disappeared. It's after work hours, and she's starting to get nervous, thinking, I'm alone in the building with the killer. And so she comes out, and they call her, and they tell her to go back in. And now she's really upset because she really doesn't want to do this. And she starts to go back in the building, and he's coming out, and she holds the door open for him, and he's bringing his bike because at this point his car was not working. And Ken Copeland was in the van, like a surveillance van with the SWAT team, and they weren't told who the arrest was or what it was about. All they were told is, this is the person, you have to take them down, they may be armed. And so they bring him down to the ground, and Ken says, you are under the arrest for the murder of Stephanie Renee Bennett. And these guys in flak jackets with helmets and, large semi-automatic weapons are cheering and hugging and crying, because this was such an emotional case for members of the Raleigh Police Department who had followed this for so long. And he was armed. They found a gun in his cargo pants, and they believed that had he had an opportunity to get to that gun, it would have been suicide by cop, because he did not want to be taken down. He wanted to be killed, or it would have killed himself before he would have been taken into custody, for what was about to come next. He knew was not going to be there was not going to be a good outcome here.
Now, a little bit later, and because I want to introduce this character too, because he's fairly important, is Michael Teague, and he's the forensic psychologist. And what did he think about the gun, Drew having the gun? He had a little different twist on it, or a little different take, an idea why he thought.
Well, he felt that Drew Planton was a control person, and that his last ultimate, act of control would be to take his own life, so that he would not be in a position of having to ever sit in a courtroom and answer questions or just listen to people talk about him, that was the worst thing that he could imagine was to be the center of attention. And so Dr. Teague witnessed if you will, the interview that night, where they had him in the interview room, and Jackie and Ken and alternately came in and out, and Drew Planton never said a word. He was restrained, and he was sitting in the room, and he never said a word. He sat there and basically went into what appeared to be a completely unresponsive catatonic state. Now, Dr. Teague believed that he was making it up, that he had resigned himself to the fact that again, nothing good was going to come of this, and that he had just decided to shut down. But it was, up for debate as to whether he was literally, in a catatonic state, or whether he had just decided, I'm not going to talk, and I'm going to act as though I can't communicate. But he was not communicating at all, and never did. He went to court the next day. They had to wheel him in. He was tethered to a wheelchair, and they said the reason for that was that he wouldn't walk, he wouldn't go to the bathroom, he wouldn't eat, he was just acting completely unresponsive. And from there they sent him to the prison, because they said they couldn't keep him in the jail. They sent him to the prison that had mental health facilities, which was just down the street, which was ultimately also the place that, had he been convicted or received the death penalty, it was the prison that he would have ended up in anyway. So he went there almost immediately after his arrest.
Now, that was at the first interview, and obviously he obtained the services of a lawyer at some point. Just tell us how police proceed with this. He's obviously gone for mental assessment. How do things work from there?
Well, the next thing that happened is they received search warrants to search his apartment. And that was very eye-opening, because when they finally were able to get into his apartment, they learned a lot about him. He was a hoarder. He had, if you can imagine this, floor-to-ceiling boxes full of pornography, many magazines and movies that had never been opened, video games, shoes, clothing. He had fetishes for many different things. Shoes was one of the things that they think that he was obsessed with for some reason. Tennis shoes, again, never opened up. A lot of items belonging to women. He had lists of other women, MapQuest directions to their homes, articles ripped out of the paper from the different murders, Stephanie's murder specifically. But then they found something really interesting, which was they found a check and some items taken from a girl's house in Michigan. And they started to run all these names through their computers. And again, this is 10 years ago. It wasn't quite as easy to Google somebody, but they were getting hits from some of their law enforcement databases. And one of these women, it turned out, had been killed, a woman by the name of Rebecca, had been killed in Michigan, had been murdered 6 years prior. And so all of a sudden, they started to see this picture of this may not be the only incident. This guy may be a serial killer. And so they immediately contacted the Lansing, Michigan police and started trying to connect these cases. And they found a gun in the apartment in Raleigh with a ballistics that matched this, basically what had become a cold case, Rebecca Huseman's case in Michigan 6 years prior. And in fact, that detective said that he never put those files away. He said they sat on the corner of his desk and got dusty because he always knew that someday the case would be solved. And it was a woman, a young woman. She was a dancer at a local bar, and she was shot as she was getting out of her car at her apartment complex early one morning. Completely different MO. But
right.
There were other cases in the Michigan area that were similar to Stephanie's case, and they had a task force looking at all of the cases, and they were never able to connect Drew Planton to those cases. But they always believed that there were other women, and that Rebecca and Stephanie were just the two that they could prove at that point.
Was there enough evidence to be able to prosecute him for the Rebecca's murder as well?
There was. The ballistics was an absolute match, and they were also able to go back and find a sighting of him in the neighborhood where she was killed.
Right.
The district attorney said that absolutely he was in line to be charged for that case and would have been charged for that case, but that was not to be because he was in the prison. He started to talk. He started to get more privileges. He started to talk to the psychiatrist. And so he started to get more freedom in the prison, and he was no longer under a suicide watch. And ultimately, he took his own life. He hung himself in his jail cell with a sheet, and it happened. Basically, he was arrested in October, and this happened just a day after New Year's in 2006. And so the case was just over. It just ended. And it was quite a bittersweet ending for a lot of people because for Stephanie's family, they felt like they never got any answers. And for the investigators, they felt like they had worked so hard to bring him to justice, and yet they too would never get any answers as to why somebody would do this and why Stephanie, and maybe get some answers that would help them prevent something like this from happening again.
So he never spoke to any psychologists? They were not successful in speaking to him when he was at the institution whatsoever? Nothing was...
They did, but none of that information ever became public because the case ended once he killed himself. And had it gone to trial, there certainly would have been a psychiatric evaluation that would have been part of the court record, part of the public record. But as you know, with HIPAA regulations, there was really nothing that was ever made public from that situation. His mother did sue the prison system, saying that they were negligent in allowing him to come off the suicide watch. But again, kind of going back to Dr. Teague's theory, this guy was very bright, and his ultimate form of control was making sure that even to the very end that he was calling the shots. And that's exactly what he did when he took his own life, because he was able to stay out of the courtroom, never put himself through that, and also never give up any information that might have made some difference in terms of, again, preventing this from happening in the future and maybe giving Stephanie's family a little bit of peace. I hate the word closure. I don't ever use it because it doesn't ever happen. And they are people who are still very much grieving their daughter, the loss of their beautiful daughter, as every family that loses a loved one. But they did want answers. They wanted to know what this guy, what made him tick, and they wanted to know more about what happened. And maybe they would have found out, maybe they wouldn't have. I mean, if he didn't talk, I don't know that they ever would have gotten those answers, but I think that there was just a real, a bittersweet feeling as to how the whole thing ended.
Well, it was a somewhat happy ending, and at least that they did find their man, and that their efforts were rewarded at least. And it's not closure whatsoever, but at least when somebody's in prison, there is at least less unanswered questions. Who did it? It becomes not so much the issue. What was the reaction from the family? What was the reaction? I mean, obviously it would be pretty obvious, but what was the reaction from, say, the father, Carmen, and Jennifer, the parents?
Yeah, I mean, they were devastated. I mean, obviously their goal was to see him brought to justice, whether that would be life in prison or the death penalty, depending on how the jury went in that case. But they were clearly happy that he was off the street, that a dangerous person could no longer do this to anybody else's daughter. But they did hope to see this go through the court system and, again, find out some answers. And so it was just kind of the end. And I think that it made it very difficult for them to move beyond the situation because it just ended so abruptly. Like I said, Carmen Bennett had also filed this lawsuit against the apartment complex, really, I think, in an effort to do something, to be able to have some kind of justice for his daughter. But again, they were very happy that the system had worked from a law enforcement standpoint and that this very dangerous person was off the street and would no longer be able to hurt anybody else. And, I think that there was still some thought that had this gone on, had the investigation continued, that, again, they might have been able to solve a few other cases other than just Rebecca Huseman and Stephanie Bennett, because it's very unusual for somebody to go that long a period of time and not kill in between, especially somebody that was as methodical and organized as he was.
Yeah, it seems that if you look at the profile, that's what police do these days. They look at it and they go, yeah, certainly people escalate in their crimes, and so when you see a particularly organized and yet very heinous crime scene, you realize that they didn't start with this one. It just doesn't make sense, so it doesn't fit the profile.
Exactly. And the belief was that Rebecca Huseman's murder was probably an aborted attempt, an early attempt to do something similar, but it didn't work out. And that's why she was not sexually assaulted, and she was simply shot because they believe maybe he panicked. But again, there was this time period in between the two, and there was evidence that he had rented cars, that he'd gone out of town for the weekend, that he had done things that were very uncharacteristic of somebody who really didn't have any friends or any connections with other people. And so, as you know, there are small towns all over the United States where people are murdered and they are maybe drug addicts or prostitutes or homeless, and the investigations go nowhere, and their DNA is never put into a database, and because they don't have the resources or the technology in the particular town. And so there may be other cases that we'll never know about, and I think that was really one of the major things that at least law enforcement and the district attorney were upset about, that they were never able to pursue helping solve, some of those other cases down the line.
Right. It's an amazing tale. I want to thank you very much, Amanda, for coming on the program and discussing your incredible book. It's a great story and a fantastic read.
Thank you, Dan, very much. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you. I just want to let people know you have been listening to Amanda Lamb talk about Evil Next Door, the untold story of a killer undone by DNA, and you're also the author of Deadly Dose. So a couple great books, no doubt, for people to check out. So I want to thank you, Amanda, for appearing on the program, and the best of luck in your writing career. I'm sure it'll be great, and we'll anticipate looking for your next book as well. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Dan. Thank you. Have a great night.
You too. Good night.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them.
Have a good evening. Thank you.